The Origin of Species, Chapter 7. In 1928, a German zoologist named Ernest Mayr went on a trip to New Guinea collecting many new species, particularly of plants and birds, similar to Darwin's trip on the Beagle. Mayr identified 136 new species and published a book titled Animal Species and Evolution, where he wrote about the idea that nature is discontinuous. Coyne argues this idea of discontinuity by stating that all plants and animals can fall into different groups, making it hard to distinguish between species. Instead, plants and animals fall into various clusters, and discrete clusters are known as species. But again, defining the origin of a new species is one of the highly debated topics of evolutionary biology even today. Even though those such as Darwin used the term species, Darwin was better at explaining the processes behind species changing over time, but never went into detail about how the split between two new species occurred. Coyne argues that Darwin's book should have been titled The Origin of Adaptations rather than The Origin of Species. One modern theory is the morphological species concept, which is based on how much organisms resemble each other more than other groups. Coyne used this example of how tigers would be classified as any organism that was cat-like, 5 feet or more long, and had stripes on an orange body, pointing out that the only problem with this theory is that it does not account for much of the diversity within a group of organisms. For example, in sexually dimorphic species, males and females can appear very different, leading one to accidentally believe they are different species if we are categorizing them mainly by morphology. Another example would be the extreme variation among similar insects. In mosquitoes that carry malaria, there are as many as 7 subspecies, not all attacking humans, and therefore making their threat level minute. The biological species concept attempts to account for this by explaining that organisms may be very similar, but are different species because they are reproductively isolated. Some reasons for this isolation include reproductive barriers, such as different mating seasons, displays, or pheromones, which are pre-mating barriers. For example, females of some species of Drosophila have chemicals on their abdomens that males find unattractive. Some other reasons could be post-mating barriers, which include fetus unviability or hybrid sterility. The classic example being a mule. Some problems with the biological species concept include that it cannot clearly define extinct organisms as a species because they cannot be tested for reproductive compatibility, meaning biologists have to rely more on morphologies. Also, the biological species concept cannot apply to species that do not produce sexually, such as some bacteria which produce asexually. However, this theory is still favored by most biologists because once they figure out how these reproductive barriers evolve, they can explain the origin of a new species.
When we step outside and we look at our flower bed, we see an assortment of flowers. And when we look at them closely, we might think that there's all kinds of different species that came to be all on their own because they look so different. Well, in fact, most of these have diverged from a common ancestor through geographic barriers. Now, geographic barriers can be any of the following. And basically, they're physical features that are out in our environment. So these can include mountain ranges, glaciers, deserts, and rivers, and many other ones. Basically, naturalists notice that sister species are separated by these geographical barriers. And we'll be able to see an example of that in our next slide. So here we have our diagram of what a geographic barrier when it comes into play. So when we look at number 1, this is going to be our original species of one population of flowers. When we look at number 2, all of a sudden this giant mountain range comes in the middle. And our original species and our original population is separated. So on the left-hand side, half of our population is on one side, and on the right side is the other half. So when we look at number 3, on the left side of the mountain, we have this population of hummingbirds. And these hummingbirds are our pollinators. The only problem is that this certain type of species of flower cannot accommodate how hummingbirds pollinate. So when we look at number 4, we see that the flower, after many, many generations, has transformed and able to accommodate the hummingbird by growing into these long tubular like structures, so the hummingbird can therefore get the nectar out from the flower. Now when we look on the right side of the mountain, we have these bees, which are the pollinators for this side of the mountain. And the same thing with them, they don't like the smaller tubular structures like the hummingbird does. So our flower, that from the original species, blooms into a more flatter like structure because it's easier for the bees to come into contact with those. Now let's say for whatever reason this mountain range decides to just disappear, or something happens to it, or a giant earthquake happens and the whole entire mountain collapses. We now have both of these different species, let's say, of flowers that are coming into contact with one another. So we have our tubular flowers and we have our flatter flowers. And they do look like two separate species, but honestly, when we go back and look back to step number 1, we can see they both came from the same original population and from the same exact species. So when there's a geographic barrier put into play, they have to change to adapt to their environment and to what they're surrounded with. So when we look at them, they do look like two separate species, when in reality, they diverge from a common ancestor, which is our flat purple one in number 1. So next we're going to discuss the divergent selection and biological speciation. So divergent selection is selection that drives different populations in different evolutionary directions. And biological speciation changes so much that species don't recognize each other and that their genes aren't fertile enough to be able to produce offspring. Okay, great. So what does that all mean, you ask? Well, what this means is that sometimes the species are separated or they have to adapt to their environments in different ways to where they form all these other traits and characteristics that they didn't previously have. And when they come into contact with one another later on, they can't recognize each other as being the same species because they look so different and not something that they're used to looking at. An example of this would be when some scientists took a sample of birds and separated them into 2 groups. So one of them ended up having a longer tail and the other one had an orange color. When they had the females choose who they wanted to mate with, the ones that were used to being with the long tail ones would not want to be like even around the ones that were orange in color, even though they were the same species. And those that were used to mating with the orange ones didn't want anything to do with the long tail ones. So overall, the genes wouldn't mix because of the female preference and that it's not something that they wanted or were attracted to, even though they are, of course, the same species. So that shows how divergent selection and biological speciation can have a great effect on the mixing of genes and all these alleles. So next we're going to talk about the origin of species. And for this to happen, they first need to be geographically isolated. So that means they either need to have a geographical barrier, like the mountain ranges and rivers we talked about earlier, or accidental long-distance dispersal, which is archipelagos. Now, archipelagos, this means individuals can move back and forth between neighboring islands once in a while. So an example of that would be fruit flies of Hawaii, how every few generations or so they find a way to be able to travel across the distance of water to a different island, where they'll live for a few more generations before they decide to move once again.
Satyrium helicae is an orchid found in South Africa the scientists used to study speciation. In the northern and eastern part, these orchids evolve long nectar tubes in its flowers because they are usually pollinated by hawk moths and flies with long tongues. But in the coastal area, they are mostly pollinated by short-tongued bees, so these plants have shorter nectar tubes. In conclusion, if an area has all three types of pollinator, then it is likely to result in genetic isolation because long-tongued species wouldn't be able to pollinate short-tube flowers and vice versa. Now to test geographic speciation with relation to reproductive barriers, scientists use Drosophila species as their example. They use three types of reproductive barriers, which includes mating discrimination between a pair, sterility, and inviolability of the hybrids. As a result, they found out that reproductive isolation increases with time. They related this with how astronomers discovered how stars evolved, from star nurseries to protostars to full stars, but this process takes billions of years to happen, which is why Quine also mentioned how creationists claim that speciation doesn't occur when we don't see the process. For him, just because you don't see it happening in front of you doesn't mean it's not happening at all. As mentioned earlier, barriers affect speciation, whether it's reproductive or geographic. But sympatric speciation is when speciation occurs without geographic barriers. Scientists observe this by going to an area that are too small to contain any geographical barriers. The greatest example they could find in relation to this are the cichlid fishes in two different lakes in Cameroon. They said each lake contains different species which descended from a common ancestor. One lake has 11 species, while the other has 9. There are two kinds of speciation, allopolyploidy and autopolyploidy. Allopolyploidy is when chromosomes of an individual contains more than two genomes that are dissimilar and derived from different species. Autopolyploidy, on the other hand, is when the chromosomes are derived from the same ancestral species. A significant example of this is when fertile hybrids were produced when mating with other autopolyploids, but only sterile hybrids are produced when mating with the original parental species.